Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we're coming to you from the floor of the Billington CyberSecurity Conference in Washington, D.C., where we ask key figures from across the cybersecurity industry about advances in AI, what America is doing on offensive cyber operations, whether there might be a Cyber Doomsday style attack before the November election, and a lot more. And we'll dive into the Biden administration's new effort to push back on Russian election interference efforts and the surprise seizure by the U.S. of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's personal airplane. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor. Here at the Times, we are coming to you, as you can probably hear already, live from the convention floor at the Billington CyberSecurity Conference here in Washington, D.C., and we've got a bunch of great guests coming up on the show, snippets from some fascinating conversations about cybersecurity, hacking, AI, and a lot more that we're going to bring to you later on in the show. But before we get to that, Guy, as always here, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. What an amazing experience to be doing this here from a major national security, cybersecurity conference. A couple of things on the world news front. The Justice Department this week announced that U.S. officials had seized the official airplane of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and that this move by U.S. authorities was warranted because this $13 million aircraft was actually purchased illegally through a shell company and smuggled out of the United States back in 2023. U.S. authorities captured the plane, a Dassault Falcon 900, from an airport in the Dominican Republic on Monday of this past week. This development obviously comes weeks after the Biden administration accused Mr. Maduro of fraudulently refusing to leave office despite losing a July presidential election in Venezuela. Listen, Ben, seizing the official airplane of a foreign head of state is rare. The Justice Department said in a statement that the aircraft has actually now been flown to Florida at the request of the Biden administration based on violations of U.S. export control and sanctions laws. Attorney General Merrick Garland said the seizure is an example of America's commitment to enforce its economic sanctions. But we're going to be tracking this at Threat Status, Ben, because there are obviously implications here. This could see U.S.-Venezuela tensions just skyrocket further, something that's been a headache for the Biden administration for almost 4 years now. And it's really interesting to see how this is going to play out, because I think even a Harris-Walz administration would have potentially a different posture come the end of this year. And certainly if there's a Trump administration, it would be very different. Another one, Ben, that I think is worth kind of highlighting here on the global radar was this interesting development in Cambodia, right? One of several countries in Southeast Asia that is in a kind of great power influence tug of war between the U.S. and China. Military officials in Cambodia came out in recent days and announced that the Chinese military is gifting 2 warships to Cambodia as Beijing continues funding the expansion of a key naval base in Cambodia. This has sparked fresh concern that Beijing's establishment of a permanent Chinese military presence in the Gulf of Thailand is potentially imminent. This is a body of water that's basically connected to the South China Sea, where there's a lot of friction between the Chinese naval assets and the Philippines, a U.S. treaty ally. And if China had a base there, it could really dramatically change the whole maritime dynamics of Southeast Asia. China's sea lines of communications, or S-locks, run right through the area, moving goods around the world, but perhaps more importantly for Beijing, shipping oil and minerals from Africa toward Chinese ports. This entire area would be in flux if there were ever a U.S.-China military clash over Taiwan, for instance. That's it right now. I really want to get back to Billington, the Billington CyberSecurity summit where there's all sorts of interesting things going on here this week, Ben.
There sure are, and I don't think it does seem like a coincidence, but I guess it's not, that just, as this summit is going on, the Justice Department announced today, as we're recording this Wednesday, the seizure of 32 internet domains used in Russian government-directed foreign malign influence campaigns known as, quote, doppelganger. And this is in violation, the Justice Department says, of U.S. money laundering and criminal trademark laws. Attorney General Merrick Garland, who we referenced earlier on the Maduro plane story, made this announcement today. Now, what's really interesting to me and what stood out in sort of reading this and tracking this today is that the Justice Department is saying that this is a top-down operation inside the Kremlin, that top officials in the Kremlin are directing this operation to use these domains to covertly spread Russian government propaganda with the aim of reducing, among other things, reducing international support for Ukraine, bolstering pro-Russian policies and interests, influencing U.S. voters in foreign elections, including the upcoming November 2024 presidential election right here in the U.S. And this is Putin personally as well. In the Justice Department statement, Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco said this was done, quote, at Putin's direction. And the State Department went a little bit further and announced actions to push back against Russian media outlets, including RT, which the administration says is no longer just a media company, but essentially spouting Kremlin propaganda. Now, all of this comes on the heels of numerous alleged cyber attacks by Iran-affiliated hacking groups, alleged cyber attacks, we should underline, that we've covered extensively here on the show over the last few weeks. And it's just amazing to me the scope of what we're seeing here. The Russian side focused a lot on propaganda, which we know they do very well, forming narratives, undercutting support for Ukraine, and more. But then, of course, we also saw the apparent Iran-backed hacking efforts earlier to target Donald Trump's presidential campaign, to leak internal documents. There's fear about attacks on election infrastructure, local governments, and other pieces, really, of American democracy. So coming up later in the show in just a couple minutes, we're going to hear from a number of guests here at Billington about whether they're afraid of the Cyber Doomsday event ahead of the November election, the kind of massive world-altering cyber event that would throw the entire system into chaos. But even if there's not some doomsday event, we're already seeing what looks like a really well-coordinated, multi-pronged attack, allegedly, by multiple governments, adversaries of the U.S., governments and hacker groups that seem to be acting, if not on direct orders of those governments, certainly with their knowledge and definitely with their tacit encouragement. So this is really a dangerous moment, and obviously all of those threats and more are very much top of mind here at the Billington CyberSecurity Conference. And guys, just walking around here and kind of just taking in the brain power that's sort of in this convention center this week has kind of been mind-blowing for us. What's really caught your eye as you've sort of circled the room and interacted with so many kind of power players in this realm this week?
It's interesting, Ben. The things that jumps out at me is the cohesion on the floor between the U.S. government, federal government footprint, and all of these private companies. In some sense, it's almost like the military-industrial complex, but we're talking about such a relatively new realm of the national security landscape the last 25 years or so, where there are literally dozens of companies presenting here, some of whom work with the government, some of whom don't. We're on our own threat status booth is on the side of this summit floor where there's an intelligence community village where looking over, I can see officials from the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. There are NSA officials here that we're actually going to be featuring interviews in our threat status newsletter with over the coming days. On the other side of the summit floor, there's also a DoD village, which is much more focused on military cyber activities and interaction between private companies and private ingenuity and DoD contracting. And then in the center of the summit, there's this Fed Civ village, the sort of federal civilian agencies. Interestingly, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, has its presentation area there. So there's just a huge amount of networking going on. We've been lucky enough to be down on the floor talking to people, having all sorts of conversations. One of the most interesting ones that comes up, and I know this is going to be highlighted when we get to the interviews here, is this question of how many companies here are actually focused on doing anything offensive in terms of offensive, U.S.-driven cyber action against foreign adversaries. And there aren't many. It's a very secretive realm of what goes on. Almost everybody here that talks publicly is in the defensive realm, offering cybersecurity products of various design, but that offensive factor is something you always want to kind of find out more about, and we'll have some reporting on that in the threat status newsletter over the coming days as well, Ben.
And we do get into that coming up here with some of the guests that we have from live here on the floor at the Billington CyberSecurity Conference, talking about offensive cyber capabilities and a lot of other things. So great stuff coming up here. Let's get to those interviews now. And I am pleased to be joined now by Joe Saunders. He is the founder and CEO of RunSafe. And Joe, rather than me explain to our listeners what the company is, why don't you give us a quick overview of what you all do?
Thank you. It's great to be here. RunSafe Security is a cybersecurity company. We protect critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, and we do that in a novel way. We work with product manufacturers who ship technology, and we protect their software so it can't be compromised. And so if we look at nation-state actors and cyber attacks on the grid and all that kind of stuff, our mission is to make all the infrastructure in the U.S. and beyond resilient from cyber attack.
On the issue of cyber attack, I know obviously the threat from China and China-related, China-affiliated hacker groups is top of mind right now. We've written a lot at Threat Status recently about threats from other hackers, from Iran, for example. I'm just curious how you would characterize the threat from Chinese hacking groups and how that compares and contrasts to other hacking groups. Are they more advanced than, for example, the Iranian hackers that we see? Do they have different tactics, different targets? What's sort of their MO, if you will?
Well, it's persistence and certainly critical infrastructure. But, I like to compare Iran hacking groups to gangs really transactional, looking for money to fund other operations. But, China is really looking to make wholesale changes and disrupt society. And they're doing that in a way China would always do it. A long-term view, lots of persistence. We saw that with the theft of intellectual property. But if I look at, cyber attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure, when Director Wray and Director Easterly talked about China's insider infrastructure, it means they're doing things to, preparation of the battlefield. So they are in infrastructure, and they are doing things that are hard to detect. They're living off the land, which is, something a lot of people don't understand, but it's a way to, persist on systems without getting detected, and then implementing an attack that is fileless, that no one can see, that they don't see it coming. So we know they're in the infrastructure. We know the kind of attacks they're going to do. And, if I may, RunSafe is built to block these kinds of attacks in the first place. So it's very near and dear to my heart because I think maintaining a well-functioning society is essential. And part of the way to do that is to protect our critical infrastructure, all those services we take for granted.
How hard is it when you have so many? I talk about critical infrastructure locally. So you've got a local water authority somewhere in Indiana that may not have the same view of security or the same protocols in place that you would like, for example. So you're dealing with a lot of government agencies. How hard is that to deal with?
Well, it's very hard if you look at it from, I'm going to defend my network, I'm going to defend my perimeter. But if you look at what's common across all those organizations, they're using common technology. And what is that common technology? It's often software. And so you can see, just as a nation state might go after software for widespread distribution, protection is the same way. We can do that through protecting the software itself and finding those points of access that threat actors or nation states are targeting and try to eliminate, kind of cut them off at the knees, if you will. And I think the whole idea is to go after the areas that are common instead of trying to build processes that are human intensive. We need something more asymmetric, especially given China has a 50-to-1 manpower advantage in cyber activity relative to the U.S. We need something, an asymmetric way to change that game. And I think that's the idea, is we need to embed security into the software that is already distributed to all these locations, all these vendors, all these operators of infrastructure. And that's the path to do it.
The different Chinese hacking groups, do they all kind of have the same goal? Are they working together, or are we talking about just kind of various disparate points that are kind of doing what they want? Or do they all have are they all singing from the same hymnal, as my mother used to say? Do they get, is there a directive comes down, this group's going to attack this group's going to attack this, or are they just kind of out there doing whatever they want at any given time?
No, it's pretty coordinated, as you can imagine, coming from China. But if you look at Volt Typhoon, I think the idea that they are pervasive, and that advanced persistent threat, if I could generalize it that way, that is really what is controversial in terms of trying to figure out ways to stop them, because they are everywhere and they're using multiple techniques. And when you look at various cyber attacks, you can tell based on what they're trying to do, create persistence on devices and do a much more large-scale attack in the future. That is their MO. So there's certainly some traits that are similar, and I think there's large groups that are doing things in a broad way, but they're coordinated and doing different activities as well.
I am joined now by John France. He is the Chief Information Security Officer at ISC2. John, thanks so much for coming on the show. If you would, just give our listeners a quick rundown of who you are and what you all do.
As you say, I'm John France, the CISO at ISC2. ISC2 are a member-led organization representing 675,000 members, associates, and candidates. A lifelong passion for learning in cybersecurity, and hope to make the world a cyber-safe place to be.
I want to ask you about the people within the cyber workforce, because we, rightfully so, are focused a lot on computers and networks and data security. How hard is it right now if you're a woman or man getting into this industry? It just feels like it would almost be daunting, just the sheer scale and speed at which things are moving right now.
Yeah, speed and velocity is one. Coupled with, we've also got a secure legacy as well. So I think we've got those two tensions, one running out forward and one anchoring a little bit in the past. The workforce skills gap, I should say, is pretty large. You can look at some of our studies showing it around 4 million, 4.5 million. So big hole to fill, but also lots of opportunity to fill it. Actually, 51% of hiring managers are saying they're changing their practices actually to look at non-traditional backgrounds, to look for the next generation of cyber pros. So it's not just the tradition, it's the non-traditional as well, and focusing on some of the innate skills like problem solving, logic, propensity, rather than hard knowledge and college degrees. They have their place, but traits are a big thing to try and close that. And as you say, emerging technologies is one you've always got to keep on top of.
I wanted to ask you about quantum computing. Our colleague Ryan Lovelace has written a lot about this so-called Q day, when quantum computing combines with AI to essentially, create a force that's so powerful it can break all of the encryption that we currently have. Is that real? Is it overblown? Is that the kind of thing that you think, the average American ought to be concerned about?
Good question. I think it's probably for the general consumer, not too much in the consciousness and shouldn't be at the moment. For nation states, absolutely, keeping secrets long term. As we've seen the NIST competitions coming out with new cipher suites, ETSI in Europe and others sort of going on that, it's been a concern for a number of years, so they've recognized the threat. Will it break all encryption? No. Will it break some of the asymmetric encryption that's quite widely deployed? Yes. And we rely on certificate infrastructures, that's one class, for a lot of our stuff. So actually what we've really got is a change problem coming, which is we understand the problem, we understand the solution, new cipher suites. Actually changing those out across all the devices and all the endpoints, that's the real challenge I think we've got over the next few years. Q-Day, as you mentioned, or sort of quantum relevant compute, commercial availability, crystal ball, 5 to 10 years for commercial viability, a little bit before for nation state type things, so that's why it's a concern now.
John France, thanks so much for joining us here. Really appreciate it. And I am joined now by Tom Hoffman. He is the Chief Intelligence Officer at Flashpoint. Tom, thanks so much for joining us here.
Thanks for having me.
If you wouldn't mind, just a quick overview for our listeners of what Flashpoint is and what you all do.
Great. Flashpoint's a commercial intelligence company. We support many large financial institutions, technology companies, and really what we do is we collect information throughout all parts of the internet, and we make that data available so companies can understand different threats to their organization, whether it's cyber threats or physical security threats or brand protection. There's a lot of different use cases where there's a growing need for really to understand what is happening outside of corporate networks or outside of your enterprise, and that's where Flashpoint really comes in to bring some open source capabilities to the commercial space.
Tom, I want to ask you about, sort of the role of AI and intelligence gathering, specifically from the standpoint of what the balance is between sort of man and machine. I mean, are we looking to a point where we're talking about AI does 95% of the work and humans do 5%, or is there always going to even be a human in the loop at all? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, it's been very interesting. In some ways, it's a cat and mouse game where we're always seeing new technologies, new tools come available, and they up the capabilities of different threat actors across the board. And in that sense, I think AI is just a normal, the next step, the next part of the evolution in what we've been seeing for the last 20 years. What it's doing, though, is it's really accelerating the ability for low-level threat actors who have historically had to understand something about technology or have some specific skills. AI is really equalizing that field. So now the entry into this field has really upped the game for even the low-level actors, and that's what we're seeing really the biggest transformation. The nation state sophisticated actors, they're always going to have great sophistication, great tools, great capabilities to really do some really unique things. But what we're seeing is the volume from the bottom and from the low end threat actors has really come up dramatically.
Last thing, Tom, I know you're especially interested in this, and this really jumped out to me when I was researching you, is just this convergence of physical and cyber threats. Because I do think, and myself included, even though I write about this stuff on an almost daily basis, that there is kind of this still mental wall of, oh, we're talking about the computer and the phone versus, a physical water system or a dam or some piece of physical infrastructure or a bank or anything like that. But it seems like those barriers are kind of being broken down, and there's an increasing convergence of what happens over here in the cyber domain actually translates directly to the physical domain as well.
Yeah, you're spot on. Many years ago, people talked about the air gap systems. That's never really talked about anymore. There's very few systems that are not connected in some way or have some dependency upon connected systems. And I think what we are also seeing, so there's a greater appreciation that all these systems are interconnected. They're extremely complicated. Very few people actually know how it all interconnects. And this is one where we're seeing nation states, and we see this with Vault Typhoon, that have really been moving aggressively to make it clear that they have accesses into some of the critical infrastructure. On the other side of this, we also see that there is a increasing ability for threat actors to really complicate how organizations are responding to different incidents. We see it most prominently in ransomware attacks, where in order to really put additional pressure on a company to make a payment, these threat actors will start calling individual family members. We will see these actors send gifts to people's homes. We have seen in instances where different protests, there's an underground site called Doxbin, where the whole activity of this community, it's an anonymous community, they post personal information for people all over the globe. And we see this where executives, companies, things that they always thought were very private, now are increasingly being put out online, and for threat actors to SWAT people, to call 911 to send the police to their house, or do a lot of nefarious things where no longer do you feel that when you turn off the computer that those threats are no longer going to show up at your doorstep.
That's great. Tom Hoffman, thanks so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mark Eady, you're the Senior Director for Public Sector Business Development at Coder, which makes a software platform for secure cloud development environments. What does that actually mean for the layman listener who's not here at Billington?
Yeah, great question. So you can think of what normal people who are in day-to-day office jobs use Microsoft Word. 20 years ago, the only way to use it was always on your local computer. You had to get a copy, type in a key, set it all up yourself. Nowadays, you can use Office 365, get to it through a browser. We've done the same thing for software developers, and that means that therefore all of the code, all of your data for data science, all of that sensitive information that are sensitive to your mission, or for commercial companies to their customer, to their business, is locked away and secure in their infrastructure.
So Coder is really about expanding the opportunity for sensitive work to be done in any sector from remote locations in a way that protects those locations against cyber intrusions.
Exactly, you nailed it. And especially with what happened with COVID, everyone going remote, not everyone sitting in a SCIF or right at the infrastructure a hub that they may have, whether it's cloud from some folks like AWS or their own networks. We provide them a very fast experience that it feels like they're working right on their local computer, but instead they're working on the infrastructure that's in your secure data center or cloud.
You guys have some pretty big clients, Palantir, a bunch of others, right? So, but this is essentially offering cybersecurity defense against hackers at the end of the day. And I'm asking you because we've been asking a lot of people on the floor here. It feels like the U.S. cybersecurity industry is nearly all focused on defense. And what percentage of it, in your take, I mean, you've been walking around the Billington floor for a couple of days now. What percentage of the companies here are doing offense?
Good question. We're really focused on, the best offense is a good defense. And so we are really here helping people to expand that circle of protection that they have out to areas that weren't already protected or not always protected in the same way, helping them be proactive about security of their sensitive source code and data. And that even extends to people doing data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning, which is really important for every area of our lives nowadays is advancing.
Sorry, especially if there are foreign adversaries or others trying to steal that proprietary information.
Absolutely, yes. We let you keep it inside of your four walls in your secure. By being fully self-hosted, we enable your infrastructure to handle and do things they couldn't do already.
Mark Eady from Coder, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Guy.
And I am joined now by Tim Lemasser. He is the Vice President of Worldwide Systems Engineering at Lookout. Tim, thanks so much for coming on the show. If you would, just tell me a little about yourself and what you all do at Lookout.
Hi, Ben. Yeah, thanks for having us. So Lookout is a data security company at our roots. We're best known, honestly, for our mobile security solutions, but we have a broader range of solutions as well, protecting cloud apps and services that live in the cloud. And so that's been a more recent introduction of our products, but still focus on data. Wherever data resides, that's what we're trying to do, is offer a way to protect that data.
One of the things I was excited to ask you about is this idea of the living off the land threats, because that's a phrase that we're hearing a lot more and more, but frankly, I think it's one that our listeners probably don't have a good handle on specifically what that means. If you could just kind of articulate what living off the land means in the cyber context, and are there actual foreign adversaries who are doing that right now in critical systems?
Yeah, it's hard to know whether there are adversaries that are doing that right now. Certainly there are adversaries trying to do that right now. But back to the more generic question of what is it? So living off the land refers to the idea that once an adversary compromises a system, they try to blend into the background rather than introduce new communications, exfiltration tools, or do anything that would draw attention to them. They try to leverage the tools that are already available to them in that environment. So things like PowerShell and SSL and other WebSocket, tools that allow them to just operate and exfiltrate data, spread laterally without raising any attention to themselves. And it's a concept that's not really that new. It's been given this kind of catchy, cool title, right? But we do see that many adversaries are able to do that successfully for a fair amount of time. It's hard to also know what we don't know, meaning there could be some out there, doing that right now. Eventually we'll find them, but we're getting better at detecting those kind of things all the time.
We've been hearing a lot, especially over the past few weeks, from companies like Meta, Google, Microsoft, who are warning about some of these threats. In fact, it almost seems to me these days we're hearing from them as much as we're hearing from federal agencies about the specifics of some of those threats. Is that a good thing? I mean, do you think that interplay right now between some of these major tech companies and the federal government, is that sort of where it should be in your view right now?
Well, I think you need that. You need that private-public partnership sort of relationship and interplay, as you described it. It may not be as top of mind. Maybe the government's not going into as much detail, but the government agencies are publishing information about these kinds of threats. CISA does a pretty good job. They've got a whole website dedicated to election security. FBI and some of the other agencies are publishing information. They have not only information about specific threat actors, but also just generic guidance on how election campaigns should be run to defend themselves. If you're a part of a campaign to elect a certain senator or a certain office member, how you can protect your platform or your campaign offering. So I think there is quite a bit of guidance out there. You're right that we are getting, I guess, more specifics from some of the vendors in the space, but that's because they have the tools and they provide the platforms that are being compromised in many cases, or at least trying to be compromised, that these adversaries are leveraging to try to reach us as the electorate.
Last thing, Tim, and I know this is a sensitive area and certainly don't want to get into any classified information on this, but I am just curious about, we as the United States aren't necessarily interested in doing anything to harm the middle class of one of the people in an adversarial country, or Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, for example. But they certainly seem willing and trying to do that to us, whether through attacks on critical infrastructure, social engineering, botnet, all that kind of stuff that we read so much about. What's the right way for the listeners of this show to think about the U.S. in terms of our offensive cyber operations?
I think this is a sensitive subject, as you said. I mean, there are very few agencies within the federal government have the authority to perform cyber operations or go on the offensive, as you say. On some level, you want our government to take the high road. We don't want to stoop to the lowest of the low, attacking hospitals and, doing things that would compromise water systems and things like that, like our adversaries and terrorists often do. So we want to take the high road. But there are times when it's appropriate, probably, for us to go on the offensive. Lookout, for example, makes available some data that helps government agencies make those kinds of decisions, threat intel specific to mobile, for example. But in reality, as a citizen, I would like to know that that our government is willing to do that, but I don't want to know the details of it. Meaning, I don't think it's appropriate for federal agency to disclose to the public how they're operating from an offensive perspective. It's better left, in classified environments, those kinds of decisions and methods, TTPs, if you will.
Tim LeMaster, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Good stuff. And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now. And a little bit different format on this segment for this week's show. We're going to bring back a few of our guests from earlier in the episode with this question in mind. Is there going to be a Cyber Doomsday style attack leading up to the November election? In other words, are these attacks that we've seen, alleged attacks from Iran-backed hacking groups, Russian efforts to disrupt the election, are those going to continue and snowball, and to the point that we maybe get some sort of catastrophic cyber event that really could threaten the integrity of the U.S. election or at least compromise it in some way? I posed that question first to Joe Saunders, then to John France, and then to Tim LeMaster. And you're going to hear their unique takes from, different points of view within the cybersecurity realm of whether or not a doomsday style attack is a possibility right now. How worried should Americans be heading into the election, do you think? Is there going to be some sort of this cyber doomsday, attack? Should we all be concerned about what these next 2 months are going to look like?
It's tough for me to predict doom. It's very hard because I guess if you get it right and there is doom, do you really want to be that prognosticator? But in all honesty, I don't think there will be a doomsday. I think there could be a lot of confusion. I think there could be some cyber means. I don't think there will be a large-scale attack. I do think the CISA and U.S. government and others, as we saw in 2020, are well prepared, and we learned a lot from previous elections. And so I don't think there will be a doomsday, but I do think, over time, persistence is in its own way doomsday. And I think China has that long-term view. So whether it's just one event, like a major event like U.S. presidential election, that's a big deal. But there's a longer game, at play here.
I think it's a perennial problem, not just to the US, but to any democracy in the world. And actually this year, I think something around 40-50% of the world's democracies are changing this year. So I know in the UK it was a concern, US upcoming. So yeah, it's on there. It's on there as a class of threat that we need to look at, amongst other things. Do I see a doomsday? Not particularly. Do I see some challenges? Absolutely. We talked a little bit about that pull. That's one of the pulling things into the future. And we know that we've got to try and produce a secure landscape for those things to happen in. So no, not a doomsday, a concern, yes, something we can and should tackle.
We're 2 months away from the election here in the U.S., and we've been writing a lot about some of these hacking Iranian-backed hacker groups and other hacker groups targeting whether it's local governments or other sort of, the infrastructure of our election systems in the U.S. How worried should we be about that? I know this phrase Cyber Doomsday attack has been thrown out there, and that's a little bit dramatic, of course, but should we be worried about what we might see over the next 2 months as we get closer to Election Day?
I don't know if I would say worried. It's something we should be aware of, certainly. I think the biggest threat, honestly, around it is not a, day before sort of Cyber Doomsday, on November 4th or 3rd or something like that, but more so the influence operations that our adversaries, whether they be Iran or China or Russia or wherever they might be, are trying to conduct on a routine basis that have been going on for years, frankly, right? Over social media platforms, over text messages to our phones, trying to engage us, trying to sow discord and FUD in the electorate, to try to challenge us, to make good decisions about what information we believe. Sometimes it's hard to know whether that, what we're reading is real or not. And I think that's probably the biggest threat, more so than a specific event that will occur on the day or two before Election Day.
Great insights there, and obviously the possibility of a major cyber attack before the November election is something we're going to be watching very closely here at Threat Status. So thank you to Guy Taylor for joining me as always. Thank you to all of our great guests. Thank you to the Billington CyberSecurity Conference for hosting a Threat Status booth there on the floor all week long. We had a great time, and we hope you all enjoyed listening to this very special episode. Please go ahead, share with all your friends, hit that subscribe button, and we will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.